All right, the president once again blasting the Russia revelations as a, quote, phony witch hunt. But for the first time, he is tweeting about his power to pardon, saying, while all agree the U.S. president has the complete power to pardon, why think of that when only crime so far is leaks against us? So what are the authorities of the president? Why would he be even thinking about that? Joining us now is Robert Ray, former Whitewater Independent Counsel, and Matthew Axelrod, former senior official for the Department of Justice. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Robert Ray, let's give people a little bit of a primer. They're going to hear a lot about two words: clemency, mercy or reducing a penalty for someone, and pardon, which is removing them completely, exonerating them from any type of punishment or crime. What can the president do?
I don't think there's any question that the president has the absolute right to pardon.
Which means even if I were convicted of a crime, he could say, Cuomo doesn't go to jail.
Correct, or even before proceedings are instituted. I mean, a pardon could be issued before you ever got to the point that an indictment was returned, for example.
So he can say, Cuomo is under questioning about what he did with the Russians. I pardon him in advance.
He could take preemptive action. That's correct.
Matthew Axelrod, do you agree?
I do agree. I do agree. I think there is an open legal question as to whether he could do that with regard to himself. But when it comes to others, I think he has the legal authority to do so. Whether doing so would be something that would be in keeping with the expectations of the country is another question.
Pardoning oneself. What's your thought on that?
I think that's right. I think that's never been reviewed before, but the better view, consistent with the Constitution, which is where you would start, is that it wouldn't make a lot of sense if the president were able to pardon himself, because the Constitution also provides that if the president were removed from office by impeachment, he is thereafter subject to prosecution according to law. If he had the power to pardon himself, he wouldn't be subject to prosecution thereafter according to law. And I think the better view, therefore, is that he would not be able to pardon himself. But it's never been litigated before. It would probably reach a court if we ever got to that point. And that would be a question I would imagine that a court would review. Otherwise, the pardon power is unreviewable. It's a non-justiciable political question, which in English essentially means hands off. The courts would not touch that question.
So, Matthew, even if you found out that Cuomo was pardoned by the president in exchange for a free lunch, some bargain for exchange, it was a deal, would that be meaningful in terms of any legal implication?
Yeah, potentially. I think, again, we're in uncharted territory here, but I think the better view of the legal scholars who look at these issues is that exchanging a pardon for something else, a quid pro quo, if you will, would be improper. What the consequence of that, again, I don't think we know, because to my knowledge it hasn't happened before, but that's contrary to how our system of laws work in all other contexts. You can't use even though you have the legal authority to do something, that doesn't mean you can use that legal authority in exchange for a bribe, for example, or something like that.
Robert, what do you make of this discussion that we're talking about this? Obviously, this got leaked somehow.
Sure.
Somehow this was being discussed in the White House. Why? The context, we're not really sure. And the president wanted to get on top of it, as he often does, through Twitter. But what do you make of the discussion?
I think it's a preliminary discussion. The president's not a lawyer. I mean, if you were president, wouldn't you want to know what the limits of your authority are? I mean, it doesn't seem to strike me as an earth-shattering notion, as you would in ordinary course of conversation around the dinner table with your own family, want to know and talk about the issue of the president's powers under the Constitution. I mean, I don't think it extends much beyond that. I don't, to suggest that that's the same thing as saying he's giving preliminary thought to and giving rise to actual action to carry out an intent to circumscribe or cut off the investigation, I think is a bridge too far. I think it's obvious the president wants to know what his authority is.
Well, and then you get to, well, why? And Matthew, one of the questions would be, if the president does believe that this is a situation where someone close to him could get railroaded, in his estimation, that could be another context for why he wanted to know what he could do about it, right?
Yeah, perhaps. Although there's no indication so far that anyone's going to be railroaded. You have the former FBI director and Marine, Robert Mueller, with an impeccable reputation, who's leading the probe, and he's hired career prosecutors and DOJ alumni who have excellent reputations.
The president's been pecking at that, though, Matthew. The president's been pecking at it, to play on the word impeccable. He said in this email, this interview, he was like, oh, and that Mueller, their conflicts. He sat in that chair right where Maggie Haberman was. The president was saying, wanting to be the FBI director, their conflicts, and all those guys he hired, they're all Democrats and Democrat contributors. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I don't make much of those allegations. I mean, obviously, if there were something that came to light about a true legitimate conflict, that would be serious stuff. But the fact that the White House called former Director Mueller in to interview for the FBI director job, I think actually can be flipped the other way. Director Mueller had served his country for 12 years as FBI director. The FBI needed a new director after the president fired Jim Comey, and so if the White House called him, it's not surprising that he would be willing to at least entertain the idea of stepping into the breach once more. But the notion that that was a job he was agitating for, I find hard to believe. I also find it interesting that the White House had such confidence in Robert Mueller that they were willing to consider him as FBI director one day, why the next day all of a sudden they don't think much of him at all.
And a man, Robert Mueller, who is not just a decorated individual in service to the country, but he is a registered Republican, was roundly praised by Republicans when he was made special counsel. Robert, just in terms of the rules of the game, you were referring earlier to what the Constitution lays out with the ability to check the president. Of course, we have impeachment proceedings. And if you are impeached, then as president, you are vulnerable to criminal procedures. Could a president
That's the Nixon precedent.
So could a president be indicted?
Well, that's also an unsettled question. I mean, we faced that issue during the Whitewater investigation. At least on 2 occasions that I'm aware of, the advice of the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice was sought on that question. It's a little bit of a complicated issue about whether or not a sitting president could ever be charged or prosecuted. That question, it remains open, and in part it comes down to your view about whether or not you believe in a unitary executive branch, whether or not the independent counsel statute is constitutional, about which a majority of the Supreme Court believed that it was, with a prominent dissent.
We don't even have one now.
Correct, and Justice Scalia was firmly of the view, believing in a unitary executive, that it's not possible to imagine a circumstance in which a president could be indicted because he has and maintains the entirety of executive branch power. But look, it's an open question. I think the better view was that the president, consistent with the Constitution, if impeached, would be thereafter subject to prosecution, which was the issue that I faced in the Clinton investigation, which is the question about whether or not he could be charged after he left office. We sought the views of the Office of Legal Counsel, and they agreed with that.
That's why I asked you.
There you go.
Robert Ray, thank you very much. Matthew Axelrod as well. Thank you for your perspective. Appreciate it to both of you, gentlemen. Thank you. Allison.
Okay, Chris, 15 years into the battle, American troops now reveal new challenges in Afghanistan.
Jared Kushner put out an 11-page statement for the public record,
sharing his side of the story about Russian contacts.
Mr. Kushner has the most to lose in this moment in the investigation.
We have a lot of ground to cover. We certainly want to know about several of the meetings that have been alleged to have taken place.
The administration is supportive of being tough on Russia, particularly in putting these sanctions in place.
He hasn't made the decision yet to sign that bill one way or the other.
If he vetoes the bill, we will override his veto.
I am confident that the Russians meddled in this election, as is the entire intelligence community.
The president basically said to me, maybe they did it, maybe they didn't do it.
This is New Day with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your new day. We do begin with breaking news for you because Jared Kushner has put out an 11-page statement saying that he did not collude with any foreign government. The president's son-in-law and senior advisor he will be facing tough questions on his contacts with Russia in just hours when he meets with the Senate Intel Committee.
It's a very well-crafted 11 pages, and it certainly outlines all context from Kushner's perspective with Russian officials, including what he knew about that meeting with the Russian attorney that Don Jr. invited him to. Now, the question this morning is going to be that what will the impact be of Kushner's answers on investigators, especially when you get to the special counsel and, of course, Congress? We have it all covered. Let's begin with CNN Justice correspondent Pamela Brown live in Washington with the breaking details. This is an unusual circumstance, but these 11 pages are what Kushner wants the investigators to believe when he meets with them.
That's right. He wants this for the public record as well. And this is the first time, Chris and Allison, that President Trump's senior advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner is sharing his side of the story about his Russian contacts. And he said in this 11-page statement, flat out, I did not collude nor know of anyone else in the campaign who colluded with any foreign government. I had no improper contacts. I have not relied on Russian funds to finance my business activities in the private sector. And he insists that he had no additional meetings with Russians other than the 4 contacts that had been reported already, though he did provide fresh details about these meetings. He says besides a quick meeting, meet and greet with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak last April at a reception at the Mayflower Hotel, the only other Russian contact during the campaign was the now infamous meeting at Trump Tower with his brother-in-law Don Jr. Kushner claims he did not read down that email chain whereby Don Jr. is told that he would be receiving incriminating information from a Russian attorney about Hillary Clinton. Kushner claiming he would get hundreds of emails a day during the campaign, and he just didn't read through each email, including this one. And he also tried to emphasize in the statement how he viewed the meeting as meaningless, saying, quote, reviewing emails confirmed my memory that the meeting was a waste of our time, and that in looking for a polite way to leave and get back to my work, I actually emailed my assistant from the meeting after I had been there for 10 or so minutes and wrote, can you please call me on my cell? Need excuse to get out of meeting. He says there was no follow-up that he's aware of, no knowledge of documents being offered. He says the only thing he remembers was a discussion about adoption. He then went on to detail what he said was the second meeting with Ambassador Kislyak during the transition, saying Kislyak wanted to meet with him to address U.S. policy in Syria. He says during that meeting, Kislyak asked for a secure line to conduct the conversation with generals in Moscow. Kushner told him, according to the statement, there wasn't a secure line at the transition headquarters, so he asked if it was possible to use existing communication channels at the Russian embassy. Kislyak said that wouldn't be possible, and nothing happened after that, Kushner says. Clearly, he is pushing back on any notion that he wanted a secure back channel to Moscow. After that, at Kislyak's request, he met with Sergei Gorkov, the head of the Russian state-owned bank, VEB, who had a direct connection to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Kushner says that meeting lasted about 20 minutes, and he claims it was only about relationship building as part of his role in the transition, and that no personal business was discussed. That contradicts a statement from VEB that says this meeting was about Kushner's business. So clearly, in this 11-page statement, Jared Kushner is painting this picture that these contacts with Russians during the campaign and the transition were meaningless and insignificant in his view. Back to you, Allison.
Pamela, there's so much to parse in this 11-page statement. Thank you very much for diving in and analyzing all of that for us. So there are mixed messages coming from the White House on whether the president supports another big story event that will be happening this week, this bipartisan bill in Congress that would punish Russia for interfering in the U.S. election. CNN's Joe Johns is live at the White House with that part of the story. What's the latest, Joe?
Good morning, Allison. You know, it was recently, not long ago, that the White House was lobbying against that bill to punish Russia for meddling in the last election. Now there's pressure mounting on Capitol Hill to do something, which could mean the president's going to find himself in a no-win situation. All this when the newly retooled communications team here at the White House went out to talk about it over the weekend. There was more mixed messaging.
President Trump's new communications team offering muddled messaging about whether the president supports a bill that will limit his ability to unilaterally lift sanctions on Moscow. Newly appointed Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders signaling the president is open to signing the legislation.
The administration is supportive of being tough on Russia, particularly in putting these sanctions in place, and we support where the legislation is now.
But incoming White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci sounding more uncertain.
Is President Trump going to sign the Russian sanctions bill?
We got to ask President Trump that. You know, it's my second or third day on the job. My guess is that he's going to make that decision shortly.
The new communications director also telling CNN that President Trump still does not accept that Russia attempted to influence the 2016 election.
He basically said to me, hey, you know, this is, maybe they did it, maybe they didn't do it.
A stark contrast to the unanimous and unwavering beliefs reiterated by President Trump's own intelligence officials in the last week.
There is no dissent. And I have stated that publicly.
Everyone's on
And I've stated it to the president.
I am confident that the Russians meddled in this election, as is the entire intelligence community.
No doubt at all, and I stand behind the intelligence community assessment that we produced.
With 3 of his inner circle scheduled this week to speak with congressional investigators looking into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, the president unleashing his anger at both political parties, once again calling the investigation a phony witch hunt and an excuse for a lost election, while attacking fellow Republicans for doing very little to protect their president. The president raising eyebrows a day earlier by asserting he has the complete power to pardon, suggesting that might include his family, his aides, even possibly himself in relation to the Russia probe.
I'm in the Oval Office with the president last week. We're talking about that. He says he brought that up. He says, but he doesn't have to be pardoned. There's nobody around him that has to be pardoned.
One of President Trump's lawyers offering a contradictory message.
We have not and continue to not have conversations with the President of the United States regarding pardons. Pardons have not been discussed, and pardons are not on the table.
The House is expected to take up the sanctions bill as early as tomorrow. The New York Times is reporting that when they reached out to Scaramucci to ask him about the confusion over the president's position on the bill, he told them he was still new to the information. Allison and Chris.
Joe, thank you very much for all of that. We'll talk about it with our panel. Let's bring them in. We have CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger, Bloomberg News White House correspondent Margaret Talev, and former U.S. Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Ambassador Nicholas Burns. Great to see all of you. David Sanger, I want to start with you. If you read this 11-page statement, this extraordinary statement from Jared Kushner in the first person, in his own words, do you read it as someone who was confronting a steep learning curve, somewhat over his head in his new role as senior advisor, had a lot on his plate, and so a lot of things like what he says were casual meetings with Russian officials slipped through the cracks, and that's all there is there?
Well, certainly, Allison, the way he's trying to portray himself in this 11-page document is as somebody who was completely new to foreign affairs, couldn't remember after he had met him the name of Sergei Kislyak, the longtime Russian ambassador to the United States, who suggested at one point, Kushner himself said he suggested that if they needed to set up a secure communications line to the Russians, that maybe they should go to the Russian embassy in Washington and use their phone lines to go do that. I've never been in the Foreign Service, but our fellow panelist Nick there has, and I suspect there are people in the Foreign Service world and certainly in the counterintelligence world who would have a problem with that. So his defense here is basically, I was overwhelmed and a little naive about how all of these happened. I didn't know who I was meeting. I think the most interesting part, Allison, was his description of the Donald Trump Jr. meeting with the Russian lawyer and the parade of other Russians who were there. He maintains the part he was in was mostly about adoptions, that as you heard, he wanted to get out of the meeting early. But what he's missing is that the purpose of that meeting, if you talk to people who've done Russian counterintelligence, was mostly to see if the Trump campaign, or the transition at that point, was, the campaign at that point was receptive to getting information about Hillary Clinton, to receiving Russian government data about Hillary Clinton. That's what the meeting was all about, and he seemed to have missed that by his own account.
And one of the interesting revelations about Don Jr.'s emails, Nick, is that it shows that it's not a hoax. It's not a witch hunt to be asking these questions, because the Russians were obviously trying to move on people close to the president. Now, Jared Kushner gives himself some space on that meeting. He says, I showed up late. So whatever was said before the adoption, I don't know. I wasn't there. That's the implication of the statement. But as someone who does have such profound knowledge of Foreign Service, to David Sanger's point, he presents himself as overwhelmed and naive. Is that good enough for you?
Well, I think that's the key question for the Senate Intelligence Committee and for the special counsel. Chris, I think that the major thing here that I would like to relate today is how strange and bizarre it was that the Trump campaign spent so much time thinking about Russia. They were running for election in the United States. It's not unusual for campaigns of either parties to have incidental contacts with foreign officials just to get to know them, to exchange views. But to have this repeated focus by the campaign chairman, by the president's son, by the president's son-in-law, by the president himself on Russia, I find strange and bizarre.
Jared Kushner says in his statement he had very little contact with Russia. Yeah, he didn't even remember the ambassador's name.
But look at the campaign in total. And Chris, what the most important thing here are the statements that Donald Trump made as candidate and now as president. He's rejecting the intelligence community's assessment of whether Russia hacked our election. He's been doing that since the autumn. He has repeatedly excused what the Russians have done in Ukraine and Crimea. He hasn't even been for the sanctions that nearly every other Republican has supported on both of those issues. He is the weakest president we've had on Russia. I think that's the central story from a policy perspective.
Margaret, you've had a chance to read through this. Let me read for our viewers one of the salient moments, and this is Jared Kushner talking about that Russian attorney that Don Jr. set up the meeting with. I had not met the attorney before the meeting nor spoken with her since. I thought nothing more of this short meeting until it came to my attention recently. I did not read or recall this email exchange before it was shown to me by my lawyers when reviewing documents for submission to the committees. What do you see here, Margaret?
Yeah, when you look in totality at this 11-page statement, it attempts to do at least two things. One is completely distance him from any notion that Hillary Clinton and her, fate in the election entered his calculus. And two is to sort of preemptively state that his own business interests, that the Kushner companies were not tied up in his thinking at all about this meeting with the bank chief, the Russian bank chief who had the connections with Vladimir Putin. There is so much material in this 11-page statement, but these are two kind of parallel points that I think are really important to understand that he is underscoring. And the third is, as all statements attempt to do, to set the narrative going into this interview with this Senate panel. As we know, this is a sort of an unusual arrangement. It's not what we think of as typical committee testimony. It's happening behind closed doors. It is not happening under oath, and it is with staff, but they will have a chance to ask him questions, and this is his opportunity to try to set the parameters of those questions and to shape the staff's thinking before that meeting actually begins.
But Kushner doesn't have to be under oath to
tell the truth.
Too vulnerable. Well, right, you can tell the truth no matter what, and you can be punished for not telling the truth without being under oath before Congress. And he also is the only one who has any onus on him. He's a member of the administration. Right. Manafort isn't, Donald Jr. isn't, so he had disclosure responsibilities, and that'll be part of the questioning today. But there are other issues as well. David Sanger, what do you make of the president's posturing on the sanctions bill? We get it. We get it from Anthony Scaramucci. When he hears Russian interference, he hears, I'm illegitimate. So he doesn't like it. He rejects it. Doesn't matter how many people say Russia interfered. He's going to fight it. This sanctions bill puts him in a little bit of a pickle, but could he not sign this? I mean, haven't members of his own party told him, we're going to override your veto on this? It matters to us?
Well, Chris, I don't think he's got a choice here. First of all, in this political atmosphere, if he vetoed this bill, first significant piece of legislation to reach his desk as president, maybe the only piece of significant legislation that will reach him in this session of Congress, he would be in the position of appearing to do Vladimir Putin's bidding. Because this bill is exactly what both President Trump in his interviews with us last year at the Times and what Vladimir Putin want to avoid. Mr. Trump said in those interviews that he thought that the sanctions that had been imposed after the annexation of Crimea and the military action in Ukraine were an impediment to building up a better relationship with Russia. He didn't quite go so far as to say he wanted to get rid of it, but that was the implication. Now, this legislation actually expands the sanctions. It doesn't do it in a very dramatic way, but it certainly puts specific sanctions on individual Russians and entities for the election hack. So by signing the bill, which I think he's going to have to do, he is basically acknowledging that the Russians were responsible for the hack. I don't think that will change in any way his continued effort to sort of muddy that up. And as you say, the reason for that is clear. He is not capable of, in his own mind, of saying they tried to interfere in the election and it probably didn't affect the outcome. He's a legitimate president anyway. All he hears is this is a way to attack his legitimacy.
And once and for all, we can say, it's not us speculating about it. His own comms director said that the president, this is his reckoning of it. So
that's right.
It's not speculation. It comes from the White House.
Panel, thank you very much for all of the information and perspective.
All right. And look, just to further the point, the intelligence agencies agree. Doesn't matter which one of them you ask, from which administration, they say Russia interfered in.
It is in part our fault when you lose an election with someone who has, say, 40% popularity. You look in the mirror and say, what did we do wrong?
This is something a lot of Democrats don't want to hear. What do you mean? It wasn't the media? It wasn't this Donald Trump and hate that made us lose the election? Maybe it was the Democratic Party? A lot of Democrats don't want to hear that. Well, that is Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, the highest elected Democrat in the country, saying the party needs to blame itself for losses in the 2016 election. Not Russia, not Comey. Well, but the Democrats in elected office right now are doing something else other than just looking back. They're looking forward. And they have a new economic agenda called A Better Deal. What is it? Joining us now is Democratic Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She serves on the House Appropriations Committee, Democrat from California. Of course, good to have you with us this morning.
Glad to be with you this morning.
We'll talk about the politics in Schumer and what that means for your party. We will. But I want to know, what is the better deal? We've been pushing on the Democrats. What are you going to come up with? Where are your ideas? The headlines I get are this: create full-time jobs for 10 million Americans, crack down on big corporate mergers, lower prescription drug prices. How do you weave those three things together?
Sure, and thank you very much, Chris. Later on today, this full agenda will be rolled out. But I can tell you, first, let me just speak to the process in terms of our leadership. Our communications team met with the majority of the members of our Democratic caucus, and we're a very diverse caucus, and got input into this agenda. And what they found through the meetings and discussions was that people really want to look at where Democrats stand in terms of economic security, in terms of good paying jobs, in terms of health care. And so we have a variety of districts. We have suburban, rural, urban districts, and this message was discussed so that we could make sure that we could talk about what we stand for in all of our districts. But what's important is our agenda and what we do to make sure that people throughout the country, not just Democrats, but Republicans, Greens, Independents, know that we're fighting for them for economic security.
Well, so you have the message, and there's no question. I mean, I remember growing up, the Democratic Party was the blue-collar party, and that seems to have switched now, where the Republican Party is the blue-collar party and the Democrats are the white-collar party. Do you agree with that assessment?
No, I don't agree. When you look at our history in fighting for good-paying jobs and fighting for lifting people out of poverty, 47 million people living below the poverty line, working, the working poor, low-income individuals, the middle class. Democrats historically have fought to do that.
True, but you don't feel that there's been a narrative shift in terms of how the parties are perceived?
Well, that may be because of the headline sound bites. It may be because we haven't done a good enough job in really communicating our message and what we stand for and who we are and what we have done and will continue to do. And that's why we're rolling this out today, to make sure that the public understands that we're not only fighting for Democrats, we're fighting for the country. We're fighting for economic security, for jobs, for living wages, for health care. And they will see that we have been there all along, but we just haven't been able to break through in terms of the sound bites in the media.
Any how when it comes to 10 million full-time jobs?
Well, it will be rolled out later, and I think all of us will have our piece in terms of how we're going to work within the, I mean, remember, we're in the minority now in the Congress, but we're still fighting for infrastructure, for efforts to, I'm on the Appropriations Committee, for example. And let me tell you, we worked on the bills last week, and it's very clear that the Republicans stand for millionaires and billionaires, these huge cuts. Look at State Department cuts. They want to propose 30% in cuts, cutting workforce training, cutting apprenticeship programs. We're trying to make sure that the public understands we're there fighting to make sure they have the skills and the education necessary to compete in the global economy so they can have a better standard of living for their families. That's what everyone wants.
Prescription drug prices. This is a huge thing for Democrats and Republicans. Everybody will agree the ACA needs fixes when you look at the individual markets. It often comes down to cost structure. Drug prices are a huge part of cost structure. How aggressive do you think this move will be on lowering drug prices?
When you look at the Affordable Care Act and where the improvements are necessary, prescription drug costs are one area. And we're going to work hard to make sure that we look at the VA, for example, to make sure that we ensure that people have a chance to reduce their prescription drugs through perhaps bulk buying and through economies of scale. And so it's very important that people understand. We've been trying this for years. It hasn't worked. But we will definitely move forward so the public understands what it takes to make it work, and that is, first, the Republicans must stop this effort to repeal and take away health care from 22 million.
Well, look, this could be something where you find some common ground, because a lot of Republicans talk about drug prices as well. It'll be interesting to see if we can see some type of cooperation on it. And as you say, the details will be out later today, but there is something that we should discuss that we know about right now. You talked about appropriations earlier. Ryan is taking the AUMF out of the appropriations bill. It's not going to be part of what hits the floor and gets discussed. What's the AUMF? Just so everybody remembers, the authorization for the use of military force. Everything that the U.S. military does right now, it's still doing under official authority from 2001, the War on Terror. It just doesn't make sense, Barbara Lee. It just doesn't make sense that we're still fighting on language against the Taliban in 2001. The world has changed. Why doesn't Congress step up and own its constitutional responsibility to declare war in situations?
Congress is missing in action. This resolution, I was the only one who voted against it in 2001 because it was overly broad. It was 60 words, and it gave authority to any president to wage war forever, perpetual war. And I've been trying for years and years and years to repeal this and say Congress must debate and vote on whether we vote up or down. The substance of it we would discuss, the costs and consequences. We're 16 years into this. What happened in the Appropriations Committee was finally I was able to get bipartisan support to pass this on a voice vote. And people actually applauded after it was passed because we had worked very hard for years to build this kind of bipartisan support. Example of bipartisanship. So what happens in this overall process? A bill moves from the Appropriations Committee onto the floor, needing to go through the Rules Committee, which establishes the parameters for the debate. Well, in the middle of the night, several nights ago, it just disappeared out of a 326-word document, a bill that we democratically voted on, that the people in our country asked their members to vote for as their constituents. Paul Ryan just took it out. It just disappeared. That is underhanded. It undermined our democratic process. It's wrong. And this shows an example of how they really don't want to work in a bipartisan way. And I don't know what the Speaker is afraid of. Congress is missing in action. We need to do our job. It's our constitutional responsibility. I'm going to keep working and fighting. We're building a broader base of support. And I think sooner or later we're going to get this done.
Well, we will chase down what's going on that. And we look forward to the details of the better deal later today. Barbara Lee, thank you for being on New Day. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Glad to be with you, Chris.
All right, Allison.
All right, Chris, we're going to have much more on our developing story. Jared Kushner's new statement released just this hour, what he says about that meeting with a Russian lawyer at Trump Tower.
When heartburn hits, fight back fast with new Tums Chewy Bites. Fast relief in every bite.
I love the president, and I'm very, very loyal to the president. I love these guys. I respect these guys. I love the president. The president's phenomenal with the press. The president himself is always going to be the president. I think he's got some of the best political instincts in the world, and perhaps in history. He's done a phenomenal job for the American people.
All right, that's the new White House Communications Director, Anthony Scaramucci, wooing President Trump, Sean Spicer, the former press secretary, is out, as you may have heard. So will these changes somehow turn around the White House's messaging and its relationship with the press? Let's bring in Chairman of the American Conservative Union, Matt Schlapp, and former White House Communications Director under President Obama, Anita Dunn. Great to see both of you.
Great to be here.
Anita, I want to start with you. Anthony Scaramucci is an interesting guy. He is on the record, on Twitter, on videotape, disagreeing with many of President Trump's positions. Anthony Scaramucci is pro-choice. He's pro-gun control. He's against the death penalty. He's called President Trump a spectacle. He said that he doesn't like how President Trump has spoken about women. I mean, I could go on. How is this going to work for him to be the head of President Trump's communications team?
You know, it's not unusual for people who in the past have disagreed with a candidate to end up working with them, especially when you've gone through a contested primary process. This does seem to be a rather aggravated example of that. You know, Anthony Scaramucci has made the decision he is going to be Donald Trump's spokesperson, and in that capacity, he is in many ways like his lawyer. I've always said a good press secretary is like a good lawyer. You're arguing your case. What's interesting about his approach to the job is that rather than seeing it as a job where he's communicating the administration's priorities out to the public, at least initially he seems to see this job as one where he has to communicate to the president how great he is. That is a non-traditional job description to the White House communications director.
That's a diplomatic term. It's a slightly non-traditional. And Matt, look, it's been said before that there is a constituency of one sometimes when you hear the press office speaking, because they know that they're going to go back to the White House and President Trump is going to give them a grade on how he thinks they did. So sometimes they telegraph their feelings directly to the president. As you heard, I think Anthony Scaramucci, they're saying, I love the president is wonderful. But what about all of these different positions that he's had than President Trump? Does he just sublimate his own feelings? And now he's no longer pro-choice, he's no longer pro-gun control, he no longer has any objection to what the president has said in the past?
Yeah, it's the hard, cold reality, Allison. When you join an administration, when you work for a White House, it's no longer about your opinions, it's about the president's opinions. And the hard thing for people who are in the communication shop who have to actually speak for a president is they have to kind of put their ideas aside. And the reason why you take the job, you might ask yourself, well, why would someone who has disagreements with the president take the job? In most cases, it's because they really admire that president they work for. They like the agenda overall. And they want to be an asset to that. But I can't tell you how many times in my experience when people are having beers at the end of the day, then the real honest disagreements come out. But when the cameras are on, you've got the president's back.
Yeah, I get it. But it just seems to me that he's farther away from the president's agenda than we've heard other recent press secretaries.
That's right.
Well, let me just play for you. I mean, this is the thing that Anthony Scaramucci says he wishes he hadn't said and that he could take back. So this is where he was on Fox News calling President Trump a name. So listen to this.
That's another hack politician.
You call Donald Trump a hack?
He's a hack politician. He's probably going to make Elizabeth Warren his vice presidential nominee with comments like that.
Do you think he's a
It's
plant?
anti-American. It's very, very divisive.
You think Donald's a plant?
And I'll tell you who he's going to be president of. You can tell Donald I said this. The Queens County Bullies Association. You got to cut it out now and stop all this crazy rhetoric.
I mean, he calls him anti-American, a bully, a hack. I mean, just one more second with you, Matt. This is a long bridge to cross for Anthony Scaramucci.
Yeah, let me tell you, Allison, I think about this every time I come on your show. Words come to haunt you. And I don't think the president, if he's ever mad at Scaramucci, I think you might play that tape for him and remind him that he said these things. But look, the president has seen it all. And I know that they have a good and warm personal relationship. And actually, it's exactly what the White House needs. The president needs a communications team who he will listen to and who he respects at this time more than ever.
Anita, President Trump just has a new tweet out right now. Let me read it for you. I know that you haven't seen this yet, so you'll be responding in real time. Drain the swamp should be changed to drain the sewer. It's actually much worse than anyone thought, and it begins with the fake news. So President Trump does, look, President Trump does his own communicating with the public. Anthony Scaramucci then has to, I guess, expound on that or sometimes clean it up. He is going to have a challenging job?
He has the most challenging job in Washington because, I think most presidents feel at the end of the day that their communications could be better, that if people just understood them better, they would have much more support. Again, Donald Trump is his own communications director, his own political director, to some extent his own chief of staff, as he was his own campaign manager. That makes Anthony Scaramucci's job that much more challenging. I think that as he actually learns what the job is, because of course he has no government experience, the same way the president has no government experience, he may find that it is indeed tougher than he had thought.
Be very interesting to see what happens over the course of the next few days and weeks. Matt, Anita, thank you very much.
Thanks, Allison.
Chris.
Thank you.
All right, Democrats hoping to turn the tide in 2018 by unveiling an economic plan today. People have been calling for the Democrats to step up with ideas on the ACA, on the economy. Well, they say, we have a better deal. What is it? Details next. All right, so which is it? We're getting mixed messages from the White House on whether President Trump supports this bipartisan effort in Congress to further punish Russia for interfering in the U.S. election. CNN's Joe Johns is live at the White House with more. What's the latest on this?
Good morning, Chris. It wasn't long ago that the White House was opposed to some key provisions of that bill to punish Russia for interfering in the last election. Now, with pressure mounting on Capitol Hill to do something, the president may be facing a no-win situation. After that big communications shakeup over the weekend, another round of mixed messaging.
President Trump's new communications team offering muddled messaging about whether the president supports a bill that will limit his ability to unilaterally lift sanctions on Moscow. Newly appointed Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders signaling the president is open to signing the legislation.
The administration is supportive of being tough on Russia, particularly in putting these sanctions in place, and we support where the legislation is now.
But incoming White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci sounding more uncertain.
Is President Trump going to sign the Russian sanctions bill?
We got to ask President Trump that. It's my second or third day on the job. My guess is that he's going to make that decision shortly.
The new communications director also telling CNN that President Trump still does not accept that Russia attempted to influence the 2016 election.
He basically said to me, hey, this is, maybe they did it, maybe they didn't do it.
A stark contrast to the unanimous and unwavering beliefs reiterated by President Trump's own intelligence officials in the last week.
There is no dissent, and I have stated that publicly.
Everyone's on
And I've
board.
stated it to the president.
I am confident that the Russians meddled in this election, as is the entire intelligence community.
No doubt at all, and I stand behind the intelligence community assessment that we produced.
With 3 of his inner circle scheduled this week to speak with congressional investigators looking into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, the president unleashing his anger at both political parties, once again calling the investigation a phony witch hunt and an excuse for a lost election, while attacking fellow Republicans for doing very little to protect their president. The president raising eyebrows a day earlier by asserting he has the complete power to pardon, suggesting that might include his family, his aides, even possibly himself in relation to the Russia probe.
I'm in the Oval Office with the president last week. We're talking about that. He says he brought that up. He says, but he doesn't have to be pardoned. There's nobody around him that has to be pardoned.
One of President Trump's lawyers offering a contradictory message.
We have not and continue to not have conversations with the President of the United States regarding pardons. Pardons have not been discussed, and pardons are not on the table.
The House is expected to take up the sanctions bill as early as Tuesday. The New York Times reports that when they reached out to Scaramucci about the confusion over the president's stance on the bill, he said he was still new to the information, apparently getting up to speed. Chris and Allison.
Joe, thank you very much for all of that reporting. Let's bring back our panel to discuss it. We have Michael Smerconish, David Sanger, and Jeffrey Toobin. David Sanger, I want to start with you. You have an article in the New York Times about this morning. This is a pivotal moment for President Trump in terms of the sanctions against Russia. And it's a dilemma for him, because if he goes along with Congress and he signs the legislation to sanction Russia, well, that must mean that he agrees with the intel chiefs that, in fact, they meddled. And, of course, it scuttles his attempt to reset this relationship with Putin if he does not sign what Congress wants him to sign in terms of sanctions. Well, that has all sorts of political consequences. So what's going to happen here?
Well, Allison, I think he'll sign it. And I think he'll sign it because if he, in this political atmosphere, vetoed a bill that appeared...
And multiple areas